Does God exist? And if so, can it be proven or shown with some kind of evidence? Thomas Aquinas develops 5 ways that he thinks he can show that God exists. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs for the existence of God. First, we'll talk about some of his preliminary apologetic questions. Apologetics is just a word that means the defense of the existence of God or the defense of a religion. Apologetics, it's a certain kind of doing philosophy. And then we'll look at the 5 proofs themselves. This is from the Summa Theologica, Preliminary Apologetics Questions. He asks whether the existence of God is self-evident. This is a rejection of Anselm's ontological argument. But what does self-evident mean? Right? It means something that is true by definition. For example, a bachelor is an unmarried man. Right? That is true by definition. It doesn't need to be proven. It's undeniable if the correct definition is understood. Or, for example, the 3 fundamental principles of logic or laws of logic, Aristotelian laws of logic. You can see my critical thinking videos for that. Something like something can either be true or false and not both at the same time and in the same way. Right? That's true by definition. Anselm says if the definition of God is truly known, then his existence is self-evident. Those who deny God's existence do so because they do not know the definition of God as necessary being. Right? So self-evident, he says, is where the predicate is included in the essence of the subject. So when we say bachelor is an unmarried man, right? The predicate is unmarried man. And that is included in the essence of the subject. The subject is bachelor because those 2 things mean exactly the same thing, right? So it's true by definition. That's what self-evident means in Anselm. But Aquinas says it's not happening, right? Or man is an animal. For animal is contained in the essence of man, right? Those 2 things are not equal, but it is true by definition because man, if you even understand what the first word means, you already know that it includes the predicate, which is animal. So all you're really doing is describing the definition. So it's true by definition. Man is a type of animal, namely a rational animal. God's existence is self-evident in itself, but not as known to humans. All right? So Aquinas sort of affirms something about what Anselm is saying. He's saying that God's existence is self-evident in itself, but none of us know this. All right? So we all fall into the category of people in Anselm's statement where those who deny God's existence do so because they do not know the definition of God as necessary being, right? So nobody knows God's essence directly. God exists of itself is a self-evident proposition. For the predicate is the same as the subject because God is his own existence, all right? So usually objects have an essence, which is in answer to the question, what is it, right? It's form. So you might say a red rubber ball, all right? So that's an essence of a thing, but that does not mean that it exists, right? That's an additional statement. The red rubber ball exists, right? So essence and existence are 2 different things, usually, except in the instance of God. They are the same thing. So necessarily he exists, which is what Anselm and Aquinas both agree on, but that doesn't mean that everybody knows it or that that is a self-evident proposition, right? So God equals being. Aquinas says, now because we do not know the essence of God, the proposition is not self-evident to us, but needs to be demonstrated by things that are more known to us, though less known in their nature, namely by effects. So, in other words, we do not know of God's essence apart from, let's say, him telling us what his essence is in the Bible, but we can know something about God through his effects, right? We see, like a crime scene investigator, we go to a crime scene and we see broken glass and blood on the ground, and we collect all this data together and we see all these effects and we try to figure out what the cause is. That is the kind of thing that we're doing in these 5 proofs. We look at the effects of God and then think backwards to figure out what the cause of this crime scene is, or the existence of the universe is. We look at the universe and we try to figure out what the cause is. So Aquinas' proof proceed from effect to cause, because effects are more known to us. In any good argument, we proceed from what is more known to what is less known. That's what learning is. All right, so he asks whether it can be demonstrated that God exists. All right? Demonstration can be made in 2 ways. One is through the cause, and is called a priori, and this is to argue from what is prior absolutely. All right, a priori is a type of reasoning, a method of reasoning. Right, this is reasoning or knowledge that proceeds from theoretical deduction rather than from observation or experience, i.e., what can be figured out without collecting additional data. Okay, the other form is through the effect and is called a demonstration a posteriori. This is to argue from what is prior relatively only to us. Right? A posteriori is reasoning or knowledge that proceeds from observations or experiences to the deduction of probable causes. Okay, so you ask a question, and do you need to figure out the answer, or do you need to go collect information? Right? If you need to figure out the answer, it's a priori. If you need to go collect more information, it's a posteriori. Let's take, for example, the Empire State Building. All right? So in a posteriori, think post. Post means after. What are the dimensions of the Empire State Building? How many windows does it have? Right? You have to go out and you have to measure it. You have to count them. Or you have to go talk to somebody or look it up on a website what the dimensions are. Right? You need to go out and you need to find more information. You need to observe something. You need to gain an additional experience in order to gain that information. All right? That's posterior. That's after experience. Do we find the answer after observation or experience or not? Right? So this is a case where it comes after. Posteriori. Posterior. All right. A prior to experience. A priori. Does the building occupy space? Once we've measured the dimensions, what's the volume? Right? Do we find the answer with more observation or not? Right? So when we ask what the dimensions are, we have to go out and you measure it. And now you have some numbers, right? But now somebody asks you what the volume, all you got to do is sit down with a piece of paper and process those numbers until you have the volume, all right? So the height times the width times the length, and you have the volume. All right, that is a priori. That's deduction. So that's just 2 methods of reasoning. And so his original question here is whether it can be demonstrated that God exists. So he has investigated what the word demonstrated means. There's 2 types of demonstration, a priori and a posteriori. He continues by saying, when an effect is better known to us than its cause, from the effect we proceed to the knowledge of the cause, and from every effect the existence of its proper cause can be demonstrated, so long as its effects are better known to us. Because since every effect depends upon its cause, if the effect exists, the cause must pre-exist. In other words, we show up on a crime scene and we see a bunch of shattered glass and blood on the ground, and we know that we are looking at an effect. So there must be a cause. But this is a posteriori, going from effect to cause and gathering information. All right, this is the type of demonstration that Aquinas prefers. We understand effects or personal experiences better than we know why a thing happened, right? The cause. You experience things, and then afterwards, when you're thinking about it, you try to figure out what the cause was of your experience, right? You get in a car accident, and you already do know that you were in a car accident. And then you have to, afterwards, figure out why the car accident happened, right? So the effect is more well known to us. The experience is more well known to us. So we start there. If we know that something is contingent, which means does not have to exist, then it is an effect, right? The car accident is contingent. The crime scene is contingent. My existence is contingent. I didn't have to exist, right? My parents didn't have to have met each other, right? Or they could have chosen not to have a child, right? So I did not have to exist. Nothing about who I am necessitates my existence. Whereas some things like numbers have to exist in virtue of their own definition, right? So when something is contingent, it's an effect. We know that all effects have a cause by definition, even if we don't know what the cause is. Just like in science, we take in all the evidence of what we know best, the effects or our experiences, and we use them to judge the cause, right? This is really just a description of science, any type of science, not even necessarily a physical science, but even a social science, all right? Philosophy is, in the broadest sense, called a science as well, right? We're just investigating causes. And so knowledge is the knowledge of causes. Because there is no intrinsic property about the universe, the whole universe, that says that it exists necessarily, that is, it has to exist, that we cannot even imagine it not existing. So this is to say, if something has necessary existence, that means we cannot imagine it not existing. Even more precise is to say that it would be illogical to say that a thing does not exist. But there's no property of the universe, of the Earth and of the solar system and of the galaxies. There's no property about those physical objects that make it illogical to think they could have not existed. You know, if things happen in a slightly different way, then perhaps Earth would not exist, or our solar system, or our galaxy, or the whole universe. If things happen in a slightly different way, our universe didn't have to exist, right? There's nothing necessary about the universe's existence. Therefore, the universe is an effect, a contingent, that must have a cause, right? So that's why scientists try to investigate the history of the universe and figuring out, okay, what's the first cause? Maybe the Big Bang, right? Sometimes people postulate the Big Bang, but then they want to figure out, well, why did the Big Bang happen, right? What was prior to that? Where did the universe come from? Hence, the existence of God, insofar as it is not self-evident to us, can be demonstrated from those of his effects, which are known to us. All right, so that's just preliminary considerations before we actually get into the 5 proofs. We haven't proven anything yet. We've only just shown we all already know that cause and effect exist, and that we investigate causes by looking first at the effects. All right, so he asks whether God exists. We'll see if that can be proven. The following arguments are deductive, meaning that if the premises are true, the conclusions are necessary. All right. If you want to know the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning, go look at my critical thinking videos. Inductive reasoning is basically the observation of patterns, and it may be wrong because it does not really proceed in a mechanical, logical kind of way, right? Deductive reasoning is more like math. If you understand what 2 means, and if you understand what addition means, then you can understand that 2 plus 2 is 4. That's deductive reasoning. That cannot fail. That if the premises are true, the conclusion has to follow from them, right? So these are deductive kinds of reasoning. So then, in order to investigate the merits of these arguments, you have to investigate the premises and whether you agree with the premises. So that's your task, to investigate the merits of the premises. Enter with an open mind, willing to learn something new. Remember from Plato's allegory of the cave that new ideas are uncomfortable and sound strange. But the danger is in remaining blinded by ignorance. All right? So remember Plato's allegory of the cave, and that new ideas are always uncomfortable. So it's important, even if you do not become convinced of these proofs, right? They have a long history and continue to be a very active area of debate in modern philosophy. And these have been used not just by Christians like Aquinas, but they've been used by Muslims and Jews. So it's very important to understand these things in our multi-ethnic, pluralistic society of today as we communicate with people who have these different religions. And also, it's important to note in a historical way that the discussion of these 5 proofs and other proofs for the existence of God have been very important for the development of formal logic and of analytic philosophy. They have, and of course, the philosophy of religion more broadly. All right, also your task, we don't want to be fools either, so we must assess the validity of the argument and the soundness of the premises. All right, we want to enter with an open mind and humility, and the humility to potentially admit that we're wrong and change our mind, right? But at the same time, we don't want to be fools. So all this to say that we judge something not on our emotional response and not on what sounds familiar, but on the merits of the logic itself, okay? Because these are very formal logical arguments, probably more formal than most everything else that you will encounter in this course. That's why I have these prefatory remarks. All right, now let's get into the 5 proofs themselves from the Summa Theologica. The first one is one type of cosmological argument, right? Of the 5 proofs that he gives, the first 4 are cosmological arguments. Cosmology is about the structure or an order of the universe, right? That is just a field in philosophy, kind of like metaphysics. Metaphysics investigates existence and being. Cosmology investigates the order of the universe, right? So a cosmological argument from motion, also known as the unmoved mover. It proceeds thus. First, he says, it is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. All right, that's obvious. That's a premise. All right, things move. No problem. 2, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. So, to be clear on that statement, which is a lot simpler than it first sounds, let's just understand some terms, right? Potency or power, potentiality, is the quality of having the ability to act, but having not yet acted, right? We say someone has potential because they might become something great, right? They have the ability, but they haven't done it yet, right? We have the potential to choose. We have the potential to act in a certain way. The potential to stand up and walk around, right? Potential. Actuality, or act, is the quality of having had exercised the potency, all right? So I have the ability to stand up, but I am not, in fact, standing up. But when I actually do stand up, that is an action. That is an actuality, right? Potency and act. Potency is like an empty glass, and actuality is like the full glass. For example, babies have the potential to learn English. Once they learn it, they actually know it. This is an act of linguistic power in human nature. Once they actually know English, they have the further potential of speaking it. While sleeping, an adult actually knows English, but is only potentially speaking it, right? So potentiality and actuality are relational in their definition. When speaking, the adult both actually knows English and is actually speaking it. All right? And then we define motion. Motion is just moving from potency to act. So any motion that occurs is happening because something is between potency and act, right? So if I hold up a rock and I drop it, scientists say that my holding the rock has a potential energy, and then it is seeking stability, is seeking harmony. When I let it go and it is unsupported in the air, it falls because it is in motion, right? It is exercising the potency by actually falling, and then once it hits the ground, it has reached full actuality, all right? It no longer has potentiality. The potentiality has been filled up, like a cup that has been filled up with water. You cannot fill it anymore. It cannot fall any further. All right, so motion is moving from potency to act. This is just to say that all motion is an action or activity, right? That's a very sophisticated way of just saying that motion is activity. All right, and let's go back up to number 2 where it's in bold. It says whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, right? So it was me who held the rock up. So something has to have been has to have had a prior cause, right? Anything that moves was pushed by something else, something prior. Number 3, but nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Right, that's what I just said. That means that thus that which is actually hot, he says, as fire makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold, right? So a piece of wood is, if it is burning, it is potentially cold, because once you blow the fire out, now it actually is cold. But now that it is actually cold, it is potentially hot once you set it on fire. You see how potentiality and actuality work? He continues, it is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. Okay, so far, all that he's established in this argument is that whenever something is moving or changing, it has to have been set in motion by something that was prior to it, that was already moving, right? So if I have my cup of water on the table and it's just sitting there, it's not just going to fall over unless I come up and push it, all right? But my motion is already active, all right? My body is already in motion before it hits the cup. And then once it does hit the cup, the motion is transferred to the new object, so that every motion comes from a prior motion. So this is also to explain principle of causality, which everybody knows just because this is like one of the most basic things that our intuition tells us about, that things are caused, right? All motion is caused by something else because motion starts because something else is already in motion, right? Similar to the principle of sufficient reason. For example, a static domino has the potential to fall. It cannot make itself fall. In order to fall, an external force, namely a prior domino or a finger, must already be moving, in a state of, which is to say it's in a state of action, and come into contact with it. Therefore, something is moved from potency to act by something else that is already in act, right? Number 4. Now that you've got that down. Number 4. So again, we want to, each step of the way, investigate whether the premises are true. So far, we've basically just established that you can do science, right? Cause and effect. All right, let's keep going. Aquinas says, if that by which it is put into motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs to be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover. The staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Right? So this is just to say that when my hand hits the cup, right, the cup flies off the table. So the motion of the cup was caused by the motion of my hand. But the motion of my hand was caused by the motion of something prior, right? The motion of my internal body and even my thought processes, all right? So everything that moves has a prior cause, and it goes back and back. But the key point in number 4 is that this cannot go on to infinity. For example, if a domino was static and is now falling, its motion must have been caused by the motion of a prior domino, because the prior domino is moving. It had to have been pushed as well, all right? So there has to have been a first domino that fell over, or something that pushed the first domino. Otherwise, we will have an infinite regress, which is defined as a sequence of reasoning or justification that can never come to an end, right? You say there's a prior cause, and then there's a prior cause to that, and then a prior cause to that, and you go back infinitely. This is an infinite regress, and this is impossible, because if we never have a first, then we never have a last, and we never have anything actually happening. When you ask, why is there something rather than nothing, you cannot postulate an infinite regress because that is just a logical fallacy. For example, if you have a pile of 10 books, there has to be a bottom book, or else there's no 10th book, right? You think of a pile of books, or even apples in a row. You got 10 apples in a row, all right, and you count them. You have a first apple. But if you take the first apple away, if you take the bottom book away, well, what happens? Well, there's a new first apple, or a new bottom book, and now you only have 9, all right? So now there's no 10th book, because there has to be a first book, right? You cannot have the books just hovering there. Even if the books are somehow hovering in the air, there is still a bottom book. There's still a first book. All right, 10th depends upon 9th, which depends upon 8th, and 7th, 6th, 5, 4, 3, 2, and the first, right? A first one. There has to be a first. If there's no first, there's no 10th. This is how infinite regress works. Example of how infinite regress can lead to a sort of circularity, right? I can lift my daughter, but we can't lift each other, right? There has to be a ground that one of us is standing on. Every domino was pushed by a prior domino, but there had to be a first domino. Let's have some dominoes here, all right? So here's dominoes, and they're not moving, right? What's going to cause them to move? Well, they don't move themselves. Something prior, something else has to put them in motion, right? They're not moving themselves. You're just looking at them, right? They're just standing there. I'm waiting for them to move themselves. No, you got to push it. Somebody has to push the first domino. But does it stop? Well, no. The first domino hits the second domino, and motion occurs, right? And they keep falling. And let's say 2019 does not happen unless there's a 2018, which does not happen unless there's a 2017. And back we go until you have a first, right? Well, what was that first? Where does it all come from? Number 5. Therefore, it's necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other. And this everyone understands to be God. All right. So at this point, we have just a very abstract concept of the first mover. This is the conclusion. right? We just have an abstract concept of first mover. There has to be some kind of first mover, some kind of thing that is always in a state of actuality. And this he calls God, right? This is a thing that has no potentiality. It is pure act, pure actuality. And so it sets things in motion in nature of itself. It does not need a prior motion because it is pure motion. It is the concept of motion. It is motion in its most universal and abstract and prior sense, right? Whatever this first mover might be, and so he slaps the label on this first mover, calling it God, right? Interestingly enough, Aristotle poses the same argument and also first introduces the idea of a first mover. It was Aristotle. Aristotle is not a Christian. Aquinas is a Christian. So this just goes to show that what has been proven, if this proof actually works, which seems very compelling, then what does it prove? Right? It proves the existence of a first mover. And both Aristotle and Aquinas say that this is God, but of course they have different conceptions of God, right? Because Aquinas has a conception of the God of the Bible and Christianity, whereas Aristotle has a conception of gods in the context of Greek polytheism. All right, so summary of this argument. Everything that moves, moves because something prior moved it. If there's an infinite regress, no movement happens. All right, you can't answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Therefore, there must be a first mover or unmoved mover. Right? That's an Aristotelian concept. And this Aquinas calls God, and Aristotle calls God, but they have different conceptions about other characteristics of what God is. But who moved God, right? If everything needs a prior movement, who moved God? The unmoved mover has as one of his qualities that he is the principle of motion, that his principle of motion is within himself instead of something external. So he is the only thing in the universe where he moves himself because he is in pure actuality, right? And if you do say that there is something prior to God, then that would be God, right? So God is just the most primary thing because if there can be no infinite regress, there has to be a first, right? However abstract or concrete that first mover is, all that has been proven is that there is a first mover of some kind, some sort of unmoved mover. All right, Aristotle and Aquinas of different religions both prove this in the same way. So God is pure act, pure actuality, right? Because motion is moving from potentiality to actuality. So in God, there's no potentiality, so he's just pure actuality, right? No motion, and so therefore he is a mover and not moving, not moved, not changing. God is not changing. Because if he was changing, something prior to him would have caused the change, right? He is not changing. He is in pure actuality. All right, let's look at the second one. The other cosmological arguments are going to go a little bit quicker because they're very similar in their structure, right? This is from cause, right? Instead of from motion, this is from cause. First cause. Very similar kind of argument. First, he says, there is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. For so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible, right? This is just stating the obvious logical fact that cause and effect happens. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Obviously, all right. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediate causes, all right? So let's go back to the infinite regress thing. There's got to be a first, otherwise there's no middle. If there's no first, there's no second, and there's no third, and there's no today. He continues, but if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient causes, neither will there be an ultimate effect, right? This is saying this similar kind of thing as number 3, about an infinite regress. If there's no first cause, there's no current effect. He says, therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name God, right? So this is the same structure of the argument as the previous one, which is why it's also called a cosmological argument. The other one talked about motion. The first one talked about motion, and this one is more broadly talking about causation, right? Not just physical movement and change, but more broadly speaking, just causation in general, right? Slightly more abstract concept, causation versus movement. You can see that the similarities with the cosmological argument for motion, but this is broader, talking about all cause and effect in the universe. All right, remember, cause and effect are fundamental, undeniable principles that provide the foundation for science observing cause and effect, let alone human choice being founded on cause and effect, right? Cause and effect is like one of the first things that we understand as children. It's just a foundational principle on which all the rest of our knowledge exists. Number 3, cosmological argument from contingency, right? Contingent things exist. That's the first statement. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not be. That's the definition of contingent. That it could have been or it could not have been, right? Since they are found to be generated. Anything that is created or can be corrupted or fall apart, to say. And consequently, they are possible to be and not be, right? Anything that started to exist does not have to exist, right? Anything that starts to exist or stops existing is contingent, because it is possible, it is logically possible that it does not exist, right? If there was a time when it did not exist, and then a later time in which it does exist, then of course it's logically possible that it does not exist, because there was a time when it actually did not exist, so that cannot be logically impossible. That's a contingent thing. So in other words, everything that exists that has been created by God, or anything just in the universe, is contingent, which means it does not have to exist, right? That's contingent being, something that does not have to exist. Those things that exist but could have failed to exist, right? Second, his next proposition is it can't be that everything is contingent. It is impossible for these always to exist. For that which is impossible not to be at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. So in other words, if absolutely everything that exists is contingent, then nothing would exist, right? Because if there was a time when I did not exist, that means that I'm contingent, which means that something else brought me into existence, namely my parents, right? But my parents are also contingent, and something had to bring them into existence, right? And on and back we go, and nothing, by definition, if something is contingent, it was caused by something prior. So if there's no first, then there cannot be a second or anything else, right? Because think about the second thing that exists, whatever that second thing might be, right? If it's contingent, that means there was a time when it could have not existed, right? So its existence was caused by the first thing. But the first thing, what was it caused by? Because if it could have not existed, then something prior to the first thing had to have caused it to exist. But there's nothing before the first thing. So the first thing is not contingent. The first thing is necessary, right? For example, an empty cup has potential. It can't fill itself. You must pour water from a pitcher. An empty pitcher can't fill itself. You got to get water from a faucet, which gets it from pipes, which gets it from a water tower, and a treatment plant, and a reservoir, and a river, and the rain, and the clouds, and the oceans, and rivers, right? Back and back you go, right? And then eventually you just have this ecosystem cycle, right?
rivers and rain, and they keep refilling the ocean, and it goes in a cycle. But the ecosystem, though it may be a cycle, the earth didn't always exist. Right? What filled the earth up with water? It is a big pitcher that was filled by something prior. If there was no first, there would be none now. If everything is possible, nothing is actual. All right, number 3. Now, if this were true, that is an infinite regress, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus, even now, nothing would be in existence, which is absurd, right? So that's just saying what we've already said, that anything that exists was brought into existence or caused in some way by whatever was prior to it, which already existed. So there has to be a first thing. Otherwise, there would be nothing. What comes from nothing? Nothing. Nothing comes from nothing. So you can't say that there was once nothing and then there was something, because nothing doesn't cause anything. Nothing. What comes from nothing? Nothing comes from nothing. If something exists, it came from something. But there must be a first something, right? What did it all come from? What something did it all come from? So there must be something that isn't contingent. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary, right? There has to be a being which is not possible, but is purely actual and is necessary, right? Necessary is the opposite of contingent. Necessary is where it cannot logically not exist, right? It is illogical to think that it does not exist. So he is saying it is illogical to think that a first mover or a first cause does not exist, right? This is necessary being, something that must exist. Those things that could not have failed to exist, right? So God is not, in his view, the only necessary being, being whose non-existence is a logical impossibility. For example, numbers. Numbers are necessary, all right? The laws of logic are necessary. And some other abstract entities are necessary being, right? God is, in this view, an abstract entity in one sense, right? He is being and existence itself. He is also a concrete entity, right? He is not only the concept of being, just like number, right, or a law of logic. He is an abstract thing, being and existence. He is also a concrete thing. Step 5. Aquinas says, but every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Now it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has been already proved in regard to efficient causes. Therefore we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God, right? This is to say, necessary beings, things which it is not logically possible that they don't exist, cannot have come from nowhere. So there must be a first necessary being, all right? So like numbers, for example, right? Numbers are dependent upon something more abstract like logic, which is dependent on something else, which is just to say God. Fourth cosmological argument is from degree. This is slightly different, right? Degrees exist. Among beings, there are some more and some less good, true, noble, the like, right? So we think about someone, you can grow. You can grow in becoming a better person, all right? So better and worse implies a standard by which you measure something to be better or worse, right? Better and worse are really how close are you to the end goal of perfection, right? So comparison assumes a maximum standard. but more and less are predicated of different things, according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum. Right? So, how much do you resemble perfection? That's the degree of goodness that you have, right? So perfection is that maximum standard, right? If there's comparison and degrees, there must be a maximum standard. Maximum standards therefore exist. There is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is uttermost being, right? So something partially exists, or is decaying, or whatever, right? If there's degrees in being, there has to be an uttermost maximum being. Therefore, maximum is the cause of all else, right? So now the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus, right? This is to say, cause in the sense that the existence of degrees necessarily depend upon the existence of the maximum, all right? If something depends upon the existence of something else, that's what causation is, right? So degrees, the analysis of degrees depends upon some conception of a maximum, right? So number 5, God is the maximum in every category. Therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection. And this we call God, right? So perfection. In every type of way, there has to be perfection. And these are all constituted in the character of God. So let's summarize something about the cosmological argument. What comes from nothing? Well, nothing. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because something caused it. But what caused that something? Well, you can either have an infinite regress, or there must be a first mover, a first cause, or a necessary being, all right, or a maximum. Here's what they prove. The cosmological arguments prove, if they're successful, they prove that there is a God. Here's what they do not prove, right? They don't prove all the details about the character or nature of God. They don't prove Christianity as opposed to Islam. They don't prove Christianity as opposed to, let's say, Judaism, or as opposed to some other things, perhaps, right? They don't prove everything. They just prove something, namely that there is a God. Right? Which God? Which religion? You need additional arguments for those relying on deduction and other evidence, right? You need other arguments to debate between religions, right? But hold on. The cosmological arguments can tell us some things about God, especially as we think about maximum, if God is the maximum perfection of everything, right? What can cosmological arguments tell us about God's character, right? He must be the maximum in every category of being. Let's look at some different areas of philosophy, right? Ontology. So that means if God is the maximum, then God is being itself. God is the most absolute being. What about cosmology? God is the source of other things and the source of order in the universe, all right? God is the maximum. God is logic itself. God is order itself, constituted in this being. See also the teleological argument, which is still coming up as the 5th proof, right? Epistemology, about knowledge, right? God is the ultimate object and source of knowledge. So if you have knowledge of an apple as being beautiful or even healthy, then you get into more abstract, what is beauty and what is health? Well, they're good, and up you go to the most universal and biggest ideas. What's above beauty? Well, goodness is above beauty and the truth, right? God is the ultimate object of these things. God is those things. This abstract, truth or being or goodness, right? He is all of these things. God is the standard of truth. But at this point, God seems very abstract and vague. He seems more like a principle, like logic, rather than an actual, like, person, right? So at this point, he seems like a principle. But let's keep going. Aesthetics. God is the most beautiful being, right? We think about beauty, he must be the most beautiful. What about ethics? God is the most perfect being and the standard of morality. again, at this point, we still could think in terms of God being a collection of these principles in this vague abstraction. God is the maximum fulfillment of desire, the specific fulfillment of happiness, right? Look at my Aquinas lecture on happiness and virtue to show how Aquinas talks about happiness as the general fulfillment of desire, but that is specifically fulfilled in God. God is the maximum embodiment of every virtue, like love, justice, wisdom. Right? At this point, it starts to be evident that God has to be a kind of person and not just a principle. Because in order to be the embodiment of virtues, one needs to be a person, like love and justice. Right? Love is necessarily relational. And so therefore, there has to be a subject, a person of some sort that can be relational or wise or just, something like this. Right? If God is love, the source of its existence, the source of the existence of love, and the standard by which we measure love, then he must be relational and personal and not merely an abstraction. Right? Even personhood. All right? Personhood has to come from somewhere, so there has to be some maximum personhood. At this point, God's qualities must be the superlatives of all abstractions and quantitatively one, as well as being personal, loving, true, and good. Right? So God is all of these things as characteristics of God. And God is ultimately simple and undivisible because he is the first cause. Right? According to Aquinas, this is all according to Aquinas' conception and his philosophy, his arguments. You have to go back and specifically figure out how you agree or disagree with each of the premises or steps in the arguments themselves to see whether or not you agree with these things. Right? You have to go back and judge the merits of the argument and pose a counter argument if you disagree with them. Right? So this is just if Aquinas' arguments pan out. All right? What religion fits this? Well, so far, the three Abrahamic religions, right, which is to say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, could fit this, right? And then you might need other arguments to argue between those religions. Let's look at the fifth proof. The fifth proof is not a cosmological argument about the order of the universe. It's a teleological argument, which is also, in a different way, about the order of the universe. So the cosmological arguments talk about the origin, the beginning of the universe. Teleological argument is focused on the order inherent within the universe. That'll become clear as we go along. So the first step in the argument says, the fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. All right, so we look around us in the universe and we see that the universe has order, right? And that order is what we investigate in the sciences. And we try to describe that order with laws of physics and with calculus and different things like this, all right? Laws of nature in natural philosophy, all right? So the world has some kind of consistent pattern and order. Right, but there's not intelligence in a rock, but the rock still has to follow the laws of physics, right? The universe has a regular order and pattern. Things behave in consistent ways. This allows us to do science, the observation of patterns in nature. Things act for an end, meaning that they are governed by order or laws. Scientists talk of potential energy and kinetic energy. If I let go of a ball, it will fall, moving to seek a state of rest. We see this in other areas as well. A seed grows into a tree. A puppy grows into an adult. Weather follows predictable patterns, right? There's order in the universe, right? This is just talking about science so far. We haven't really said much of anything. Second, right, based on that, hence it is plain that not fortuitously, which is to say randomly, It is plain that not randomly, but designedly do they achieve their end. Right? So he is saying that order is either evidence of some kind of a design or of randomness, right? But order is not a product of randomness. Order is a product of design. All right? Order is evidence not of randomness, but of intelligent order. All right, at this point, we have not even proved God yet. There's still several steps to go. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move. It's important to note that. At this point, when we're talking about design, it could be something like the Force in Star Wars, right? Some sort of vague intelligence or logic. Logic itself, right? As the Stoics might say, nature is logical. Just logic, right? We haven't gotten very far yet in this argument. Let's see where he goes now. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. So that's to say that order implies design, and design implies an intelligence, right? Something intelligent, rationality, logic, something has to set things in logical order. The nature of the universe is orderly. Unintelligent things cannot create order. They can't create themselves order. Apples in a pile cannot put themselves in a row, but are set in order by intelligences, like when humans domesticate animals or set plants in rows on farms, right? But what sets intelligence is like humans to follow order, right? So there's order within us, like life cycle, or seeking happiness, other things that we do not set in motion. Parts of us are not set in motion by us, right? We do not choose to have 4 limbs or to have a digestive system, right? That order has to have been designed by something prior, according to Aquinas. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So in summary, if there is order in the universe, it had to have been ordered by something above it. So this has been Aquinas on 5 proofs for the existence of God. I encourage you, especially to perhaps look at other videos presenting these 5 views in slightly different ways to kind of get a very full understanding of the merits, or perhaps if there's flaws to the arguments, some videos may point out different things than I do in this one. So I encourage you to watch some other videos, perhaps videos that I have put in the playlist for this class, or you can find your own as well, but especially whatever I may have put in the playlist for this class. First question of the write-up: if these ideas sound strange, what should someone with intellectual moral virtue do in response? Right? When I talk about intellectual moral virtue here, I'm talking about humility or charity or things from my critical thinking video. I'm not talking about Aquinas' intellectual virtue or his moral virtue. I combine those concepts into intellectual moral virtue to talk about humility in arguing, or charity in arguing, or the ability to admit that you're wrong, things like that, right? Or courage to tell someone else that they're wrong, something like this. If these ideas sound strange, what should someone with intellectual moral virtue do in response? Think about Plato's allegory of the cave. That's a good example. What do you find valuable about these proofs, right? Even if you don't agree with them, they have been very developmental in logic and in basic reasoning and in analytic philosophy broadly and in philosophy of religion generally, even if not about Aquinas' Christian religion, but about other religions as well. So what do you find valuable about these proofs, right? Even if whether you agree or disagree with them.